So were you able to win this week? Were you able to handle it? Were you able to show them how it's done? Were you able to manage your way through the pitfalls of this rat race of society in which we live? Whether we like it or not, many of us have bought into this idea that if we just push a little bit more, if we just earn a little bit more, we can have a little bit more. Maybe if we can just have a little bit more entertainment, or if I can just have this gadget or that dress or shoes, if I can just push a little bit more, if I can maybe volunteer a little bit more, maybe if I can just be happier or smile more, in some ways I would myself feel happy. I will feel proud. I will feel noticed. I will feel loved. I will feel like I matter. It seems somehow that our relationships today, I don't know if you've noticed, have come to require a sort of perpetual drip feed of electronic reassurances that helps us in a way to define the very essence of who we are, that helps us to define increasingly by an unending weight of verdicts of the innumerable and invisible crowd of virtual judges. And while we wait for these messages, while we wait for the reactions, we are bombarded by emails and alerts on our apps and on our tablets and on our phones. We are dogged by apps that measure our personal data and share it with everybody, subjecting us to an inundation of demands to like something or to retweet it or to subscribe to it or to buy it. And I don't know if you've noticed, but we're in so much for a day. It's not called Black Friday anymore. It's now Black Week. I think that sometimes we have allowed ourselves to be overrun by this philosophy of life, this worldview, because we struggle with, in essence, with the concept of pride, the idea that we have to prove ourselves. And so this value that we place on life, that more is more, it's not just us who struggle with this. This goes back to the time of the disciples. They themselves struggled with this as well. Yes, they were attracted by the love of Christ, but they were also subject to the thoughts that somehow they will be rewarded materialistically if they are just good enough for Jesus, if they just sacrifice enough for Christ, and if they just do enough for Christ or commit enough. And so they themselves also struggled with the ideas of self-exaltation, cherishing self-compensation or complacency. And they often made comparisons between each other. We know that. And so often when one of them would fail, feelings of superiority would be indulged by the others. And this reminds me of a quote I shared earlier in the year with you, which I think describes the way in which we struggle with this very thing today. It was a quote by Brené Brown, and if we put it on the screen, this is what she said. She said, "We always judge in areas where we are most vulnerable to shame. And then we always pick people who are doing worse than we're doing, because what we're anxiously looking for is a validation that at least we are better than you." And our scripture reading, which was so wonderfully read, thank you very much, captures in a way Jesus' desire to deal with this struggle of the pride, of being proud of the things that we do and why we do them. And so take your Bibles, let's open them up at the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 20, and let's spend some time in this parable. The purpose of this parable, before we put it on the screen, if we can just take it off for a moment, the purpose of the parable is that Jesus wants to highlight how God deals with people. And so this is not necessarily a parable that's about the workers in the vineyard. This parable is about the landowner. Who's the parable about? the landowner. And so Jesus is trying to show to the disciples how God deals with people and how God expects us to deal with people, or we can put it differently, how God expects us to live with others and to live towards others. But this parable also highlights God's compassion, God's amazing grace, as an outworking of what we can call subversive humility. Now, what is that? What's humility? It's a humility that goes against the grain of the marginalization and the exclusivities of culture. It's a humility that goes against these things in such a way that it provides an alternative, transformative life, something that's different from the way in which we live. And when I look around us, when I look at the world, I get the sense that this is something that has been hiding somewhere inside our hearts for so long, that there's such a need, that the world is crying out for a different way of living. And maybe the way in which people have voted over the last few years and made decisions about how governments should go is an outworking, is a cry out for something that's more transformative than what we've had. It doesn't mean what they voted was the right thing, by the way. But we're looking for something that is transformative, something that will make us better than what we are already, something that will make us feel good about life, something that will give us hope. Something that will make us feel like this life that we're living is not something that will just end in death, but that there's something beyond. And so this is what this parable is about. And so we pick it up in verse 1, and it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard." So Jesus starts this parable off by telling us that there's this landowner, and somehow this landowner has stuff that he wants done, and so he wants to go to the marketplace. He goes to the corner of the marketplace where those who do not have work stand there and waiting for somebody to come across. We used to do this in South Africa. I remember as a child, my dad would on a Sunday morning, especially if we had a lot to do in the garden or around the house, my dad would get in the pickup truck that he got somewhere, and when we drive down these specific roads, he knew where to go. And you would just drive down this road, and these men would be standing the streets. They'd be lined in lines of people, rows and rows of these people. And as you stop, it's like they found gold somehow. They all rush to the pickup truck, and it's like the first ones that's there, they get to be picked. And then we would pick one or two, and you would see how utterly rejected the rest look. Or felt when they were not chosen. And so here's this landowner, and he makes his way to this marketplace. We can imagine he picks a few. And you just get the sense that when he offers them the standard wage of a denarius, which is 1 day's work wage, they accept this proposal with eagerness, because somehow they have this hope that maybe at the end of the day, if they just do enough, if they just work well enough, he might hire them again the next day. And they won't have to stare people in the face. They won't have to feel the glares of those who are financially secure, those who look at them as if they shouldn't be there in the first place. But notice that halfway through the morning, this owner decides to return to the marketplace. Let's pick it up in verse 3. "And when he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. And again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and said to them, 'Why have you been here, standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive.'" And so notice here, this owner goes, after a few hours, back into the marketplace. He finds them there at the same place he was before, and he offers to hire them, but he doesn't tell them what he's going to pay them. He simply tells them he will pay them what is just. They take him at his word, and they get in, or get in his van or in his truck, whatever, and off they go back to the farm. But something compels this owner to go back to the marketplace. 3 hours later, and again 3 hours later, and the scene replays itself where he gets there, he tells them that he will pay them what is just. They get into his car, and off they go back to the farm. And finally, in the 11th hour, an hour before sundown, he returns to the marketplace, and once again, he finds people. And notice that instead of humiliating them by giving them just something and say, I'm sorry, man, there's only about an hour left of the day, here's something, take it home so that you at least have some food tonight. Instead of doing them, he gives them what they really seek, which is dignity, value. So just think about this for a moment. A well-organized vineyard owner would have known at the beginning of the day how much work is needed, or how much work there is, and how many workers he would need. But within the parable, we don't get the idea that this was a young and unorganized owner. So what is it that compels him, after he gets his hirelings for the work that needs to be done, he probably hired the right amount right from the start. What compels him to go back to the marketplace and get more again and again and again? And we know later on from this parable that which drives, that which motivates this owner to go back to the marketplace again and again is compassion. Is compassion. And we notice this, especially in the last group, when he gets there. And this time, he doesn't even tell them he will pay them just. He just says, go, and they agree to go. Somehow, they must have been able to identify the reason why he comes back every time, take him on his word, and get onto that van or that truck and go to his farm. And so notice that in spite of what he said or didn't say, they decide to trust this man. And so his compassion compels them to trust him regardless of what he said. Notice that this idea of justice, I will be just, I will pay you just, it reappears 3 times, and the question in a way is answered to the listeners, those who are listening, the disciples are listening, and really the question that is being asked of them is, what is justice? What is justice? And a 3rd time, what is justice? And none of the times does Jesus give them an answer. So what is justice for somebody who doesn't have work, an unemployed person, eager to work, but who has to stand there on the corner, feeling humiliated by the pitying glances of those who are financially secure? It seems that Jesus' justice, this picture that he's painting of justice, is not about just the equal distribution of the law. But this justice is about the respect for the dignity of everybody. And when we think of the early Christian church, we notice that they felt that this was their calling, their primary expression that God's kingdom is present, that Jesus lives among us, is the fact that they were deeply concerned for the welfare. They respected the dignity of all people. They believed that everyone should have enough. Nobody should be marginalized. Nobody should be disadvantaged. Nobody should be excluded. And so you can just imagine these disciples, they are sitting there listening to Jesus, trying to get their heads around this idea of subversive humility. This concept of humility that can transform culture, that can transform norms, that can transform life. I mean, they're still getting their heads around this, and then Jesus drops another surprise on them. And that is that there is a steward who suddenly arrives on the screen, on the scene in this picture. Notice what it says, verse 8. It says, so when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first. So suddenly, and amazingly, a steward appears on the scene. A manager. Well, where has he been all this time? And why wasn't he the one who made the trek all the way to the marketplace and back 5 times during that day? You see, the reason we can ask this question is because traditionally in Jesus' time, landowners would hire people to do the work for them, and they would appoint a steward or a manager. And in the morning, they would give this steward, this manager, instructions as to what the people have to do. And then in the evening, he would report back as to what they have done. But this is different. Suddenly, we find here a manager who makes the journey in person from the farm to the market 5 times in one day. That was unheard of in Jesus' time. You know the landowner is Jesus, isn't it? And so notice that Jesus, his unconditional love for people, infuses his character with this subversive humility. It's a kind of humility that necessitates radical compassion and amazing grace to such an extent that it will transform the conventional beliefs within ourselves. And it will help us to be able to care. And it will help us to transform ourselves so that no matter who we are and no matter who somebody else is, no matter of their class, no matter their status, no matter their gender, no matter their sexual identity, no matter their race, no matter their nationality, no matter their age, they will receive God's grace. And it's this humility, it's this compassion and grace-filled humility that goes against the general expectations of the disciples and of society. And Jesus himself, notice this is Jesus himself who goes to the hurting. Jesus is the one. Through the dust, through the heat of the day, with a costly love, he goes to the marketplace of societies where people are looking for dignity, value, and meaning. And he's not finished with the surprises. There's another one. The steward appears on the scene, and the landowner tells the steward that he should pay the workers their wages. And the term wages in the original language referred to the day's wage. He should pay them all a day's wage. Let's pick it up in verse 8 again. It says, "So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to the steward, 'Call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first.' And when those who came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they would receive more, and they likewise received each a denarius." And so here we have, notice carefully, the landowner that dictates the order of the payment. The landowner dictates the order of the payment because he knows that the steward, if the steward had to pay them, the steward would use the natural order of payment, and he would have started with those who started first in that morning. And notice what would have happened if it was done the other way around. If the steward had paid those who began in the morning their denarius and said, "Thank you very much, you did a great job," they would leave, they would go home, they would feel happy, they would feel pleased that they can go home, and they would be none the wiser about the others. And the next group would come, and they would be surprised and amazed at the fact that they got paid a denarius, and they would go home, and they would be excited, and they would feel like they've mattered and they've done something that day, and they would go home, and everybody would be happy. None of the others would be any wiser. And so on until they've all been paid, all leaving happily, instead of being angry around the steward's table, as is the case. But who's telling the parable? Jesus. And when Jesus speaks, when Jesus does it in a subversive way. It's contrary to the nature of culture. It's contrary to the nature of sin. And so Jesus here tells this parable. Jesus wants his disciples to understand what subversive humility looked like. He wants his disciples to observe what radical grace and compassion looks like, even when it is extended to others, to other people. To people who are not like you and me. To people who we do not get along with. To people who do not look the same as we do. To people who do not act the same as we do. To people who are not our age. It's the same grace that gets extended to them too. And you can just imagine this tension. You can sense it in this parable. And I wonder what the disciples must have thought. And that first group eventually angrily comes to the steward's table. It tells us in verse 11 and 12. Let's read it. It says in verse 11 and 12. And that when they had received it, that's that first group who came in the morning, they complained against the landowner, saying, "These last men have worked only 1 hour." Now notice that they do not tell the landowner that he has paid them too much. Instead, their complaint is that you have made them equal to us. You have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the law of the heat of the day. You see, equal pay for equal work. We like that, don't we? And so when you find out that your colleague who does the same job as you, they get paid £100 more a month, you know, it just doesn't sit well with us. This equal pay for equal work is centuries old. But just think about this. Equal pay is not the issue here. This parable presents people that were overpaid anyway. They were all overpaid. This is not about the underpaid. This parable focuses on an equation that is filled with amazing grace, which is resented by those who feel that they have earned their way to more. Earned their way to more. This is not fair. You know, we should receive more. Just think about this. This is not the cry of the underpaid. This is nobody in this parable is underpaid. This is the cry of those who were paid justly, but who couldn't bear that others were treated with the same grace. You have made them equal to us. That sounds like the older brother in the story of the prodigal son when he shouted to his father that the grace you have shown my brother is too much. And in a way, you get the sense that what Jesus is trying to point out here for us is that we have the tendency as human beings to attach our worth. We have the tendency to directly link our self-worth to that way in which we get rewarded, the way in which we receive, the way in which we are able to do. But instead, God's grace places our human worth back where it should be. Not in who we are and what we can get, but in whose we are and His grace to us. His grace. And so notice here what happens. Jesus now responds. This is the landowner who responds, and I would like to say this clearly, who responds to the workers' intolerance at being treated equally. We do not have a corner on God's presence. We do not have a corner on God's grace. God's grace is given freely to us today and to those who are not in this building and to those who we are praying for. His grace is given equally to all. Is it possible that there are times when we become intolerant towards others because God treats us all equally? And so Jesus responds to this. The landowner responds. He says in verse 13 onwards, if we read it, "But he answered one of them and said, 'Friend,'" this is not, "Oh, you're my best friend." This is just a general term that was used to refer to somebody whose name they didn't know. "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give this to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first and the first last, for many are called, but few are chosen." Just notice with me for a moment how Ellen White responds to this in Christ's Object Lessons, how she reflects on this very passage, if we can just put it on the screen, in Christ's Object Lessons, page 403, Ellen White says the following. She says, "There are many who have given themselves to Christ, yet who see no opportunity of doing a large work or making great sacrifices in His service." She's saying that there are those who have given their lives to Christ, but they do not yet know where they can fit in and what they can do and how can they be of service to Jesus Christ. It's not that they don't want to be, they just don't know, okay? And then she says, "These may find comfort in the thought that it is not necessarily the martyr's self-surrender which is most acceptable to God. It may not be the missionary who has daily faced danger and death that stands highest in heaven's records. The Christian who is such in his private life." I had my senior pastor when I was an intern give me wise words to say, "You are who you are when you are alone." And she says, the Christian who is such in his private life, in the daily surrender of self, in sincerity of purpose and purity of thought, in meekness under provocation, in faith and piety, in fidelity in that which is least, the one who in the home life represents the character of Christ, such a one may in the sight of God be more precious than even the world-renowned missionary or martyr. That which even the greatest and the wisest cannot earn, the weakest and most humble may receive. I love this bit. Heaven's golden gate opens not to the self-exalted. It is not lifted up to the proud in spirit, but the everlasting portals will open wide to the trembling touch of a little child. Blessed will be the recompense of grace to those who have wrought for God in the simplicity of love and faith. So, you see, in a way what she's saying is that there's no joy in more is more. There is joy in the grace and compassion that we experience in the journey to faithfulness. And so in a way, if we can paraphrase, I apologize, the landowner's response, he's basically saying to these people, listen up, you think you have a complaint? Wasn't what I've done justified? Didn't I perform justly? Wasn't justice served? I've given you what I have agreed to pay you. You are free to do with that what you would like. It's yours. Am I not free to do with what is mine the way I see fit? I chose to pay these men a living wage. You will be able to go home to your wives and your children and proudly announce that you found work and you have paid for the day's work. I want these men to be able to walk through the doors of their houses with the same joy in their hearts and the same money in their pockets. I want their children and their wives to be as proud of them as that yours will be of you. I want them to feel as free from humiliation and be filled with dignity as you will be. So you think you've worked hard the full day in the sun? That's fine. What do you think I've been doing all day? Sitting around having a nice siesta. In fact, I was on the road to and fro from the market, trying to demonstrate solidarity and compassion to others who, like you, are in need of it. I could have sent my manager to this, but I went. I went myself to demonstrate, be there, and alleviate their suffering. Why are you jealous of them or angry at me? You must understand that I am not only just, I am also compassionate and I am merciful. On what basis should the grace that I show others irritate you? It appears that you do not care whether or not they can preserve their self-worth or feed their families. You want to take more for yourselves. I have chosen to give more of myself. You want to be richer at the end of the day. I have chosen to be poorer at the end of the day. It's my grace. It's my compassion. And I give it abundantly. I give it to you to share, and to share in that joy. It is not yours to hoard. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Amen.